On a luxurious flight from New York to Paris, Margot Evans, a renowned chief flight attendant, encounters a mysterious family that challenges all her principles. But behind their humble appearance lies a truth that could shake her entire career. Watch until the end to uncover the shocking secret and an unforgettable lesson. The Skybridge Airlines Boeing 777 stood motionless at Gate 14 of JFK Airport, like a steel eagle poised for flight. Through the terminal's transparent glass, the sunset cast a shimmering glow on the aircraft's body, accentuating the gold-embossed Skybridge logo. This wasn't just an ordinary commercial flight. It was a symbol of luxury and prestige, where the first-class cabin was meticulously designed to cater to the world's elite across every field. Inside the first-class cabin, everything was arranged to perfection. Cream leather seats, arranged like thrones, each equipped with a personal entertainment screen and a mahogany fold-out table. On the small trays rested crystal glasses filled with champagne, while napkins folded into lily shapes, a refined symbol of Skybridge, waited to be used. Margot Evans, the chief flight attendant for this journey, walked through the cabin, inspecting each row with precision. Her brown hair was neatly tied into a bun at the back of her head, her uniform impeccably pressed, and her black high heels gleaming. With 15 years of experience at Skybridge Airlines, Margot prided herself not only on her professionalism, but also on her ability to read passengers. To Margot, the first-class cabin wasn't merely a place to sit. It was a gateway to the world of the privileged. She firmly believed that not everyone deserved to pass through that gateway, and it was her duty to protect its exclusivity. As passengers began boarding, Margot stood at the entrance to the cabin, her smile polite, but her gaze sharp. Her eyes scanned each person. Expensive suits, luxury watches, or designer handbags served as quick markers to categorize them. "Welcome aboard. We hope you have a comfortable flight," she said in a measured tone, professional but devoid of genuine warmth, as if fulfilling an obligation rather than extending enthusiasm. The line moved steadily. Many passengers, familiar with this flight, responded with nods or small smiles. But not everyone passed Margot's unspoken filter. Then came the Tate family. Wesley Tate, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s, wore a refined gray suit. Beside him was Serena, his wife, graceful in an elegant blue dress. Behind them were their two children, Emma, around 10 years old, with blonde hair tied into pigtails, and Leo, younger, clutching a backpack adorned with cartoon characters, his wide eyes marveling at everything around him. Margot frowned slightly. The Tates appeared polite and well-mannered, but her instincts told her they lacked the air of first class. She tilted her head, leaning towards Sienna, a younger flight attendant stationed at the entrance, and whispered, "Double-check their tickets. They don't seem like they belong in this cabin." Sienna turned to Margot, her eyes widening in surprise but not daring to argue. "They have valid tickets?" "Just check again," Margot interrupted, her voice dropping a degree colder, her gaze flicking toward the family before returning to Sienna. "Just to be sure." Reluctantly, Sienna stepped toward the Tates. "Good evening. May I check your tickets once more, please?" Wesley looked at her, his eyes briefly registering surprise, but he maintained a courteous smile. "Of course," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket for the tickets. Serena also smiled, gently placing a hand on Emma's shoulder as if to reassure her, sensing her daughter's growing discomfort. Meanwhile, Leo remained entranced by the oversized seats, his excitement oblivious to the tension simmering around him. As Sienna examined the tickets, Margot stood at a distance, watching closely, her gaze sharp and unrelenting, scanning for any detail to justify her suspicion. What she failed to notice, however, was Julian Cross, a nearby passenger in the first row, observing her intently. Julian, a middle-aged man with a sharp black suit and salt and pepper hair, tapped his fingers lightly against the edge of his table. His eyes, amused and vaguely cynical, seemed to pierce through Margot's composed exterior. It was as though he understood her thoughts better than she wanted to admit. But rather than intervening, he simply smirked, as if waiting for the scene to unfold. When the Tates finally settled into their seats near the window, Margot couldn't shake the question that had taken root in her mind. How could they afford first-class tickets? Outside, the setting sun dipped lower, painting the sky in warm shades of amber. But within the first-class cabin of Flight 518, the atmosphere seemed to cool, weighed down by silent judgments and scrutinizing glances. Sienna handed the tickets back to Wesley with a strained smile. "Thank you, sir. Everything checks out. I hope your family has a comfortable flight." Wesley nodded silently, offering no further comment. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, guiding the boy into his seat. Serena gently helped him settle in, then reached into her handbag to pull out a picture book, likely to keep her daughter occupied during the flight. From a short distance away, Margot observed their every move. The Tate family showed no signs of irritation or displeasure after the unexpected check, but that didn't ease Margot's unease. To her, sitting in first class required more than just money. It required an air of sophistication, something she felt this family lacked. The first-class cabin gradually filled with passengers. The sounds of seatbelt clicks, the opening and closing of overhead compartments, and hushed conversations created a busy yet restrained atmosphere. Margot moved through the rows, inspecting every detail with a practiced eye. Each time she passed the Tates, she glanced their way deliberately, as if searching for any clue that might confirm her suspicions about their presence being a mistake. Nearby, Julian Cross continued his quiet observation, sitting with his back straight and one leg crossed over the other. His poised demeanor suggested he was no stranger to the world of first class. Julian had always been a man who enjoyed analyzing others, and today, Margot had caught his attention. As Margot walked by, Julian suddenly spoke, his voice low and precise, enough to make her pause. "Ms. Evans, is everything all right?" Margot turned, momentarily taken aback. "Of course, Mr. Cross. Is there anything I can assist you with?" Julian smiled, a subtle, knowing curve of his lips. "It's just that you seem particularly interested in certain passengers. Or am I mistaken?" His question wasn't overtly confrontational, but it struck a nerve. Margot hesitated, then offered a slight shrug. "I'm simply doing my job. We need to ensure everything runs smoothly." "Your attention to detail is admirable," Julian remarked, his gaze steady. "I imagine you're quite skilled at keeping everything just as you want it to be, aren't you?" Margot didn't respond, opting instead for a polite smile before walking away, feeling the weight of his eyes lingering on her. Up ahead, Sienna was setting up drink trays in preparation for takeoff. She glanced at Margot, her expression hesitant. Sienna knew Margot's reputation for perfectionism, but there were times when that precision came with a harshness she struggled to reconcile. "You okay?" Sienna asked quietly as Margot passed the station. Margot paused briefly, her gaze firm. "I'm fine. Let's make sure everything stays professional." "Understood?" Sienna nodded, but the uneasy feeling in her chest remained. At the back of the cabin, the Tate family remained quietly seated. Wesley was engrossed in a book, his legs stretched out in relaxed ease. Serena flipped through the pages of a fashion magazine she had pulled from the seat pocket. Meanwhile, Leo and Emma were immersed in their own worlds, blissfully unaware of the scrutiny they were under. Outside the window, the plane's engines roared to life, sending deep vibrations through the cabin. The flashing lights on the tarmac reflected off the glass panels, adding a warm glow to the interior, a contrast to the simmering tension that Margot couldn't shake. Returning to her station, Margot refocused on her primary task, delivering the safety demonstration. Yet, the image of the Tate family lingered in her mind. They were courteous and composed, but their simplicity gnawed at her. How could they afford to be here? In Margot's view, first class wasn't just a seat, it was a symbol of power. Every position in this space was earned through struggle, success, or inherited privilege. Yet this family felt like an anomaly, a disruption in the unspoken rules of exclusivity. From his seat, Julian still watched, his quiet amusement growing. He understood exactly what was unfolding in Margot's mind, and the conflict intrigued him. To him, Margot was no ordinary flight attendant. She was a woman locked in a silent battle with her own biases, a fight that was both invisible and deeply personal. As the engines began to accelerate and the cabin lights dimmed for takeoff, Margot realized this flight would not be a routine journey. It would be a test of her beliefs, a challenge to the boundaries she so fiercely guarded. The sound of the plane's engines grew steadily louder, like an ominous drum roll heralding the official start of the journey. The flight attendants had taken their designated seats in first class. Margot, sitting upright as always, couldn't entirely hide the thoughts that flickered in her mind. She cast another glance at the Tate family, but all she saw was an oddly serene picture. Wesley Tate had closed his book, his gaze fixed on the window as the airport lights blurred past, gradually giving way to an endless expanse of black night. Serena Tate placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, smiling softly as Emma pointed at the touchscreen monitor in front of her, where a list of animated movies played. Leo, the youngest, had already donned a pair of headphones, his face lit up with excitement as he found his favorite film. Margot thought to herself, "They're not like the people I usually see here." The Tates displayed none of the ostentation or brashness Margot had come to associate with certain nouveau riche passengers. Instead, they exuded a quiet composure that made her wonder if she might have judged them unfairly. But the thought passed quickly, replaced by a familiar refrain in her mind: caution is never wasted. Across the aisle, Julian Cross maintained his calm demeanor, observing the subtle dynamics of the cabin. He pulled a pen from his suit pocket, tapping it lightly against the leather cover of a black notebook. His gaze flitted over the Tate family before settling on Margot. He said nothing, but the weight of his scrutiny felt like an unspoken interrogation. Margot chose to break the tension by immersing herself in work. As soon as the plane reached cruising altitude, she rose from her seat and headed to the service station to arrange drinks for the passengers. The steady rhythm of her heels on the plane's floor briefly interrupted the silence of the cabin, though no one complained. "Red wine for Mr. Cross," Margot instructed Sienna, keeping her tone deliberately neutral. "And an apple juice for the boy in seat A2. Sienna complied swiftly, though she couldn't help but wonder why Margot seemed particularly focused on the Tate family. As Margot moved closer, Julian unexpectedly spoke, his voice smooth and deliberate. "I couldn't help but notice how attentive you are on this flight. But it seems not every passenger has earned your approval." Margot stopped, her eyes flickering momentarily. Julian's remark was not confrontational, but it felt like a challenge nonetheless. "Mr. Cross, my job is to ensure everyone has the best possible experience. I'm not paying any particular attention to anyone," she replied, her tone professional, yet faintly strained. Julian smiled and lifted his glass. "A safe answer. I admire that." Margot nodded curtly before stepping away, choosing to ignore the subtle arch of Julian's eyebrow, which seemed laden with unspoken meaning. At the back of the cabin, the Tate family remained quiet. Serena carefully retrieved a blanket from the overhead compartment, her movements precise, as if she feared disturbing others. Wesley leaned closer to his wife, murmuring something that made her smile gently. Other passengers paid them little notice. To most, they were just another family. But to Margot, they represented an inexplicable contradiction, a presence that unsettled the framework she had built around her understanding of first-class life. When Margot returned to the service station, Sienna was already there, setting up glasses for the next round of service. Without warning, she asked, "What do you think of them?" Margot paused, her hands freezing mid-motion. "Oh." Sienna shrugged, her expression tinged with curiosity. "The Tates. You seem unusually focused on them." Margot didn't answer right away. She resumed polishing a glass, her gaze fixed on her hands, as if avoiding eye contact would shield her from revealing too much. "They're just different, that's all," Margot said slowly, each word chosen with care. "Different?" Sienna echoed, tilting her head, waiting for more. Margot turned, her eyes sharp. "Sienna, focus on your work. I don't think you need to concern yourself with what I do." Sienna said nothing, though a flicker of discomfort crossed her face. From a distance, Julian Cross, quietly observed the exchange over the rim of his wine glass. His faint smile suggested that he understood far more than Margot wanted him to. Outside the window, the sky was an inky black, punctuated only by the faint glimmer of distant stars. But within the first-class cabin of Flight 518, a silent conflict simmered between individuals with clashing perspectives, their unspoken tensions waiting for the right moment to surface. Margot walked briskly down the aisle, feeling the air in the first-class cabin grow heavier than usual. She stopped at the service station, sinking onto a small stool behind the curtain, and brushed back a few stray strands of hair from her forehead. This job, with all its outward glamour, often felt like a burden to Margot. She wasn't just a chief flight attendant. She saw herself as the gatekeeper of first class, a space reserved only for those she believed truly belonged. But beneath her veneer of perfectionism lay cracks, fractures she wasn't ready to confront. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady herself. The familiar questions echoed in her mind. Why do they bother me so much? They haven't done anything wrong. The Tate family felt like a challenge to everything Margot had always believed. They weren't disruptive, rude, or even remotely uncouth. If anything, they were more courteous than many passengers she had served before. But their simplicity, their effortless grace, and their apparent lack of need to prove anything left Margot uneasy. From a young age, Margot had grown up with a clear vision of success, wealth, sophistication, and a display of class in every action. It was why she had always dreamed of working for Skybridge Airlines, where she could surround herself with the elite, even if only in a serving role. But over time, the class Margot had idolized began to clash with reality. Many of the so-called elite were far from the polished ideal she had envisioned. Some were arrogant, cold, and dismissive of people like her. Yet Margot clung to the belief that the values she revered, status, prestige, and power, were what defined this world. The Tates somehow unraveled that belief. They had nothing to prove, and that bewildered Margot in a way she couldn't explain. Up front, Julian Cross continued to observe Margot. He had taken notice of her the moment he boarded the plane. From her subtle gestures to the tension in her posture, Julian understood that Margot was not merely a perfectionist flight attendant. She was a woman at war with herself, caught between the ideals she clung to and the truths she was being forced to confront. Julian set his wine glass down on the table and pressed the call button. Margot approached, her signature smile firmly in place. "What can I get for you, Mr. Cross?" Julian tilted his head, his gaze thoughtful. "I was just wondering, why is it that you pay more attention to some people than others?" His question cut through the poise Margot had worked so hard to maintain, but she held her ground, her smile unfaltering. "All passengers here are equally important, sir. I'm simply doing my job." Julian smiled faintly, as though he had anticipated her response. "An appropriate answer. But I think you know that's not entirely true, don't you?" Margot said nothing, but the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes betrayed her. Julian leaned back in his seat, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've traveled to many places and met all kinds of people. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that we're often deceived by the things we believe in. Don't you think so?" Margot stiffened. She wanted to end the conversation, but she couldn't think of a polite way out. "What exactly are you trying to say, Mr. Cross?" she asked, her voice icy. Julian shrugged, his expression calm but pointed. "I'm just observing. You seem like a smart woman, Margot. But sometimes, intelligence can be the enemy of compassion." His words struck a nerve. Margot had never considered compassion a factor in her work. To her, it was all about precision and professionalism. Yet in that moment, Julian's remark unsettled her, as though he had uncovered a truth she wasn't ready to face. Margot walked away without another word, avoiding Julian's gaze as she returned to the service station. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up a glass, his words still ringing in her mind. Intelligence can be the enemy of compassion. She glanced toward the Tate family. Emma had fallen asleep, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. Leo was dozing as well, clutching his cartoon-themed backpack tightly. Wesley placed a hand on Serena's shoulder, whispering something that made her smile softly. They haven't done anything wrong, Margot told herself. So why can't I shake this feeling? Outside the window, the night stretched on endlessly, an abyss of darkness dotted with faint stars. But within the first-class cabin, what seemed like a calm atmosphere was brimming with silent tension. Margot knew that this flight wouldn't just be a journey to Paris. It would be a journey that forced her to confront herself, the values she had clung to for so long and the truths she had been avoiding. Margot stared down at the seating chart displayed on her tablet, her fingers scrolling carefully through the list of names. Her eyes stopped on the Tate family. The front row seats of the first-class cabin, their assigned seats, suddenly struck her as an inconvenience. Seats like those should be reserved for someone more important, she thought, her lips curving into a subtle smile as an idea flashed across her mind. With a few quick taps, Margot reassigned the Tates to a row near the lavatories. These seats were not only less comfortable, but also prone to the incessant noise of the restroom door opening and closing throughout the flight. She told herself it wasn't a significant change, but deep down, she knew the real reason. They didn't deserve the prime seats. When the Tate family boarded the plane, they were directed to their new seats. Serena looked around, confusion flickering across her face as she realized they weren't seated where their tickets indicated. "Excuse me, is there a mistake?" Serena asked Sienna, who was welcoming passengers at the aisle. Margot stepped in quickly, cutting off the conversation before it could go further. "There's no mistake, ma'am. Your family seats have been rearranged to better accommodate the needs of today's flight." Serena frowned, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "But our tickets were for the front row. Why were they changed?" Margot maintained her practiced smile, her tone polite but unyielding. "We've made adjustments to ensure maximum comfort for all passengers. These seats are especially suitable for families with young children, such as yours." Wesley gently touched Serena's arm, signaling her to let it go. He offered Margot a polite smile. "It's fine. Thank you for arranging this." Serena opened her mouth to protest further, but Wesley's calm demeanor silenced her. Together, they guided their children to the new row. The new seats nearly ruined the comfort they had anticipated. Every time the restroom door opened, the hiss of the flushing system grated on their ears, accompanied by a faint, sterile scent of disinfectant. Emma wrinkled her nose in discomfort, while Leo turned to his mother, his voice small. "Why are our seats different, Mommy?" Serena stroked his hair gently, forcing a reassuring smile. "It's all right, sweetheart. This is still a wonderful flight." Her tone was soft, but the disappointment in her eyes was unmistakable. She leaned toward Wesley and whispered, "This was deliberate." Wesley didn't respond immediately. His gaze traveled to Margot, who was busy directing other passengers. In a steady but quiet voice, he said, "You know what they think of us. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that we stay calm." Serena squeezed his hand. She knew he was right, but swallowing the bitterness of injustice was never easy. Further up the cabin, Julian Cross noticed the change in seating arrangements. He glanced at the passenger list displayed on his personal screen, a unique feature Skybridge provided for its premium members. The Tates were still listed as being assigned to the front row. How curious, Julian thought. Why are they seated at the back? Lifting his head, he scanned the cabin, his eyes landing on Margot, who was moving with practiced efficiency, attending to the other passengers. Julian had flown with Skybridge many times and always appreciated Margot's exemplary service. But today, something about her seemed different. Despite her composed demeanor, Margot exuded an undercurrent of tension. Each time she passed by the Tate family, she seemed to avoid looking directly at them. Julian began piecing the details together, and the full picture emerged. This wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. Once all the passengers were settled, Margot stood for a moment, surveying the first-class cabin. Her eyes swept the room, seeking out any signs of inappropriateness that might disrupt the sanctity of this space. The Tate family sat quietly, as if making an effort not to draw attention to themselves. But their calmness didn't ease Margot's mind. Deep down, she justified her actions by believing she was upholding the prestige of first class, that this was her duty. Yet, From his seat, Julian's steady gaze unsettled her. He seemed to know something, and that silent knowledge made Margot uneasy. Back in their new seats, Serena carefully draped a blanket over Emma, who had fallen asleep with her head on her mother's shoulder. Leo dozed off beside her, clutching his cartoon-themed backpack tightly. Wesley rested a hand on Serena's shoulder, leaning in to whisper something that brought a faint smile to her face. "They've done nothing wrong," Margot told herself as she glanced at them. "So, why does their presence feel so out of place?" Beyond the window, the night sky stretched endlessly, dotted with distant stars. But within the first-class cabin, what should have been an atmosphere of quiet luxury was charged with undercurrents of tension and silent conflict. Margot knew this flight wasn't just a journey to a destination. It was a confrontation with her own beliefs, her own sense of right and wrong. Margot walked briskly past the rear section of the first-class cabin, where the Tate family was seated. She caught a glimpse of Serena raising her hand, trying to call for a flight attendant, but Margot pretended not to see. Instead, she headed straight for the service station, telling herself there were more important tasks to handle than responding to trivial requests. Serena lowered her hand, keeping her expression composed. Emma tugged gently at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mom, I'm cold." Serena smiled softly, stroking her daughter's hair before reaching up to retrieve a small blanket from the overhead compartment. But it was tightly packed, and she struggled to pull it free. "Could you call someone to help?" Serena asked Wesley quietly. Wesley pressed the call button. 1 minute passed, then 2. No one came. Serena shook her head and said, "They're not going to come. We'll manage on our own." Without a word, Wesley stood, carefully pulling the blanket free and laying it across Serena's lap. His expression remained calm, but he could feel the weight of the indifference they were receiving. At the front of the cabin, Margot was attending to an elderly woman in the first row. The passenger had requested a glass of white wine and a particular type of cracker. Within minutes, Margot had everything prepared, delivering it with a warm smile. The woman effusively thanked her, praising the impeccable service. Margot responded with a graceful nod, satisfaction washing over her. But as she turned back, her eyes met Julian Cross's gaze from a few rows away. He was watching her intently, his expression calm yet piercing, as if to say, "I see everything." Margot hesitated briefly, but she quickly recovered her composure. "He doesn't understand the situation," she told herself, justifying her actions. "Sometimes you have to sacrifice small things to preserve the bigger picture." A short while later, Serena pressed the call button again, this time to request water for Leo. The boy had finished his dinner and was thirsty, but his bottle was empty. Margot saw the alert on her screen, but chose to ignore it, busying herself with arranging drink trays for other passengers. "Mom, I'm thirsty," Leo said softly, tugging at Serena's hand. "We'll wait a little longer, sweetheart," Serena replied, her tone calm but tinged with quiet disappointment. 10 minutes passed before Margot finally arrived. She placed a small bottle of water on Leo's tray with a curt, mechanical thud before turning on her heel and walking away without a word. Serena frowned, ready to say something, but Wesley lightly touched her hand, shaking his head. His calm expression conveyed his silent advice. "Let it go. They're doing this on purpose," Serena whispered, her voice tight with frustration. Wesley sighed, his tone gentle but firm. "Don't let them get to you. We've faced worse than this." His words soothed her, though they didn't entirely erase the sting of being dismissed so easily. Serena turned to Leo, unscrewing the bottle cap and helping him drink. Julian Cross, seated nearby, had observed the entire scene. The quiet disregard Margot showed toward the Tate family was no longer a coincidence. It was a deliberate act, communicated through small but telling gestures. When Margot passed by again, Julian called out to her, "Margot, I think you're neglecting some passengers. That's not very professional." Margot stopped, turning to face him. Her polite smile remained, but her eyes had turned colder. "Mr. Cross, I know how to do my job. Thank you for your concern." Julian raised an eyebrow, his smile faint but pointed. "I'm sure you do. But sometimes, We forget that we're all here to serve something greater than ourselves. Margot froze for a brief moment, the words landing heavier than she anticipated. Instead of replying, she nodded curtly and walked away, determined not to give Julian the satisfaction of a retort. Serena sat silently, gripping the water bottle in her hands. She said nothing to Wesley, but her eyes briefly met Julian's. For a fleeting moment, Julian gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement. I see it. I understand. Outside the window, the night sky stretched endlessly, tiny pinpricks of light scattered like stars on an ocean of darkness. But inside the first-class cabin, a quiet storm brewed, a clash of unseen forces between people separated by their roles, their status, and their silent expectations. It was only a matter of time before the tension reached its breaking point. Margot moved through the first-class cabin with her usual confident stride. Yet, she couldn't ignore the steady gaze of Julian Cross, who watched her from a nearby seat. He said nothing, but his look carried a weight of silent judgment. Finally, Julian pressed the call button. Margot hesitated before walking over. She told herself he was just another passenger, but there was something about him that unsettled her. Yes, Mr. Cross? How can I assist you? Margot asked, her voice smooth, her smile practiced. Julian leaned forward slightly, his tone low but deliberate. Margot, I think you've been neglecting certain passengers. That's not very professional. Margot blinked, momentarily caught off guard. But she quickly composed herself, her expression cool and measured. I think you're mistaken. I assure you, all passengers here are being attended to with care. Julian gave a small, knowing smile and shook his head slightly. I don't think so. I've been sitting here since the start of the flight, and I've seen quite a bit. Maybe it's time you ask yourself the same question. A slow, quiet anger began to build within Margot. She kept her tone polite but clipped. Mr. Cross, I know my job. Thank you for your concern. Julian didn't press further. Instead, he straightened in his seat and said one final thing as Margot turned to leave. Sometimes, Margot, compassion matters more than the rules we create for ourselves. It makes the world a better place. Margot didn't look back, but his words stayed with her, leaving her with the unmistakable feeling of having been exposed. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew more stifling as the flight continued. Serena tried to remain composed, but Margot's indifference gnawed at her. Leo, the youngest, tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mom, I'm thirsty. Serena turned to Wesley with a sigh. Can you call them again? Wesley pressed the call button once more. This time, Margot appeared after nearly 10 minutes, carrying a small bottle of water. Here you go, she said, placing the bottle on the table with a sharp thud, not bothering to meet their eyes. Serena frowned. She waited for Margot to leave before leaning toward Wesley, her voice low but simmering with frustration. Did you see that? She's doing this on purpose. Wesley rested a calming hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. Don't let it get to you. We're used to this? Serena exhaled quietly. She knew Wesley was right, but enduring such treatment was a bitter pill to swallow. Nearby, Julian Cross observed the entire scene. His gaze met Serena's, and she saw empathy in his eyes. It was as though he was silently telling her, I see it all. Julian pressed his own call button, though not for his own needs. When Margot approached, he spoke with quiet authority. Margot, I think we need to have a word. Margot hesitated, but maintained her composure. Of course, Mr. Cross. What can I do for you? Julian locked eyes with her, his tone unwavering. I just have to ask, why are you treating some passengers so differently from others? Margot stiffened, her expression hardening. I'm not sure what you mean, sir. All passengers are treated equally. No, they're not, Julian replied, shaking his head slightly. I've been sitting here the entire flight, watching you ignore that family. I won't make assumptions, but this isn't what Skybridge stands for. Anger bubbled beneath Margot's calm facade, but she knew she couldn't let it show. Mr. Cross, I believe you've misunderstood. Julian leaned back in his seat, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I hope I have, but if I haven't, maybe it's time you take a good look at yourself. Margot nodded stiffly, her movements rigid as she turned and walked away. But Julian's words echoed in her mind, refusing to be dismissed. Serena sat silently by the window, her fingers gripping the water bottle tightly. Leo and Emma had both fallen asleep, while Wesley kept his eyes on his book, his face calm, but his posture strained. Yet Serena knew the weight of the moment hung heavy over them both. Outside the window, the vast night sky stretched endlessly, a sheet of black silk dotted with faint starlight. But within the first-class cabin, the quiet tension between passengers and crew felt like a storm waiting to break. The plane touched down smoothly at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, the soft light of dawn filtering through the windows. Passengers began to disembark, gathering their belongings and carrying with them impressions of the long flight. Margot stood by the aircraft door, her habitual smile fixed in place as she bid farewell to each person. When the Tate family passed by, Serena looked directly at Margot, her eyes reflecting a silent disappointment. Wesley gave a polite nod, his expression calm but cold. Leo and Emma followed close behind their parents, seemingly unaware of the unspoken emotions exchanged between the adults. Margot maintained her smile, but an inexplicable unease lingered in her chest. She knew they were dissatisfied, yet she reassured herself, they won't say anything. It's over now. Less than 10 minutes after the last passenger had exited, Margot's earpiece buzzed with a call. The captain's voice came through, steady and firm. Ms. Margot Evans, report to the VIP lounge immediately. Margot froze for a moment. The captain rarely summoned her directly, especially not after a flight had concluded. She took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and quickly left the plane. The VIP lounge, located in a secluded area of the airport, was reserved for high-profile individuals. When the door opened, Margot stepped inside and immediately saw Julian Cross seated comfortably in a leather armchair. Standing farther back, with a straight posture and piercing eyes, was Wesley Tate. Margot hesitated, her breath catching as she registered Wesley's presence. Something was wrong. Before she could ask, the door behind her opened again, and the captain walked in. A man of middle age with a stern face and an authoritative demeanor. He wasted no time. Ms. Evans, the captain began, his voice measured but commanding. I need you to listen carefully. Margot nodded, trying to steady herself. The captain turned to Wesley, addressing him with respect. This is Mr. Wesley Tate. You may know him as a passenger on your recent flight, but what you likely don't know is this. Mr. Tate is the new owner of Skybridge Airlines. The word struck Margot like a thunderclap. She stood frozen, her eyes widening in disbelief. This can't be, she stammered, barely able to process what she had just heard. Wesley stepped forward, his expression calm, but razor-sharp. Why not? He asked, his voice low and deliberate. Did you think we didn't belong in first class? Margot couldn't respond. Her throat felt dry, her voice caught somewhere between panic and shame. We wanted to experience the service of the airline we just acquired, Wesley continued, his tone unwavering, each word a direct blow to Margot's pride. What we received, however, was deeply disappointing. Margot struggled to regain her composure, but Wesley's unwavering gaze made it impossible for her to meet his eyes. Julian, seated behind them, rested his chin on his hand, a silent observer of the unfolding confrontation. The captain remained composed but firm. Ms. Evans, Mr. Tate requested this flight to evaluate our service quality, a common practice for new ownership. What transpired during the flight will now be subject to thorough review. Margot opened her mouth, intending to defend herself, but Wesley raised a hand to silence her. Before you justify your actions, Wesley said, his voice calm but laden with authority, I want to know, what made you decide we didn't belong in first class? Was it the way we dressed? The fact that we traveled with children? Or was it the color of our skin? His question landed like a lightning bolt, leaving Margot speechless. She stared at the floor, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. From his seat, Julian finally spoke. I witnessed everything, Wesley. Margot's handling of the situation does not reflect the values Skybridge Airlines should uphold. Margot's hands clenched tightly at her sides, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She had no response, no way to undo what had been laid bare before her. As the room grew heavier with silence, Serena's disappointed gaze and Wesley's unyielding words echoed in Margot's mind. The reality of her actions was undeniable now, and the judgment she had passed so easily on others was coming back to confront her in full. Margot stood frozen, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Her gaze remained fixed on the carpeted floor, where a faint stain had suddenly become the only thing she could focus on. Wesley stepped closer, his movements calm yet deliberate. The overhead light cast a sharp glow on his face, highlighting his composed but resolute expression. His voice, clear and steady, carried the weight of every word as he spoke. "Why did you think we didn't belong in first class, Margot? Was it because of our skin color?" Margot's head snapped up, her lips parting to respond. "It wasn't like that. I just thought." Wesley cut her off, his tone firm but not raised. "No, you didn't just think. What you did on that flight wasn't accidental. I saw the way you reassigned our seats, the way you ignored small requests, and the reluctance in every interaction you had with my family. You don't need to say anything more. It's all perfectly clear." Margot felt as though a crushing weight had settled on her chest. She looked into Wesley's eyes and saw not anger, but a profound disappointment, something far heavier. "We didn't buy Skybridge Airlines to witness actions like this," Wesley continued, his voice unwavering. "This airline was once a symbol of class, hospitality, and respect. But what you demonstrated on that flight made me question whether we made the right decision." Margot trembled slightly. She searched for words to defend herself, but nothing could undo the choices she had made over the course of the flight. Julian, who had remained silent until now, stood from his chair. He walked forward slowly, his sharp gaze akin to that of a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. "I saw everything," Julian said, his deep voice carrying an air of finality. "As a frequent flyer with Skybridge, I know what this airline is supposed to represent. But what Margot displayed was not just unprofessional. It was a betrayal of the fundamental principles of compassion and dignity." Julian turned to Margot, his eyes piercing through her. "I don't know what drove you to act as you did, prejudice, arrogance, or something else entirely. But whatever it was, it cannot be excused." Margot opened her mouth, her voice faltering as she tried to respond. I didn't think it would become such a serious issue." Wesley shook his head, cutting her off once more. "Not serious?" he repeated, his tone biting yet restrained. "Let me explain something to you. Every action you took on that flight didn't just reflect on you. It reflected on the entire image of Skybridge Airlines. This isn't about a personal grudge between you and me. It's about the integrity of an entire system." The captain, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward to regain control of the conversation. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of authority. "Ms. Evans," he began, "what happened today will be included in a formal report. We will need to thoroughly review your position within the Skybridge team." Margot felt as if she had been struck by a hammer. She fought back tears, her voice trembling as she finally spoke. "Captain, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to. I let myself get caught up in the wrong thoughts." Wesley's gaze remained steady, though his tone softened slightly. "Apologies won't erase what happened, but at least it's a start. What I need you to understand, Margot, is that prejudice, whether large or small, has the power to destroy. You didn't just make my family feel unwelcome. You undermined the trust and values this airline is meant to uphold." Margot couldn't respond. She lowered her head, shame washing over her in waves. Julian stepped back, exchanging a glance with Wesley, a silent expression of support. Wesley looked at Margot one final time before delivering his parting words. "You'll have time to reflect on this. And I hope that the next time you serve someone, you see them not just with your eyes, but with your heart." His words hung in the air like a final judgment, leaving no room for rebuttal or justification. The VIP lounge was steeped in tension, the air heavy with unspoken judgments. Margot stood still, her hands clenched at her sides, feeling smaller than ever amidst the authority and piercing gazes surrounding her. Wesley remained silent, his expression less cold, but no less heavy with disappointment. Julian Cross, who had observed quietly until now, stepped forward. His calm demeanor and deliberate movements drew every eye in the room. "Mr. Tate," Julian began, his voice low but resonant. "I have flown with Skybridge Airlines for many years, and I have witnessed the crew handle difficult situations with grace and professionalism. But what I saw on today's flight was, frankly, disheartening." Julian paused, his gaze shifting to Margot. "I don't believe Ms. Margot acted with the intent to harm anyone. But prejudice, whether conscious or unconscious, has a way of seeping into our actions. And today, it was unmistakably evident in how she treated your family." Margot lowered her head, each of Julian's words cutting in her pride like a slow, deliberate blade. Julian continued, his tone steady but grave. Ms. Margot ignored their requests for help. She deliberately reassigned them to less comfortable seats. And when she did serve them, her attitude was clearly reluctant, if not dismissive. I can't say why she acted as she did, but what I can say is that her behavior does not reflect the values Skybridge Airlines claims to uphold. Wesley nodded slightly in agreement, stepping forward to stand beside Julian. As Mr. Cross said, Wesley began, his voice calm, yet commanding, "We are not just passengers. We are people. People like Ms. Margot, like everyone on this team, have the right to personal feelings and thoughts. But when those feelings affect the way you serve others, it stops being a personal matter. It becomes a systemic issue." Wesley turned to Margot, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "You thought we didn't belong in first class. You may not have said it aloud, but your actions spoke for you. And why is that? Was it because we didn't look like the kind of passengers you believe deserve to be here? Was it because we were traveling with children? Or was it because of the color of our skin?" Margot felt each of Wesley's words like a slap to her dignity. She stammered, I didn't mean..." "But you did," Wesley interrupted, his voice growing firmer. "And that's undeniable." Julian regarded Margot, his tone softening, but still carrying the weight of authority. "Margot, I don't say this to belittle you. I believe anyone can make mistakes. But what matters is what you learn from them. Prejudice is insidious. It often hides deep within our thoughts. But if we don't confront it, it will continue to control our actions and hurt others in ways we might not even realize." The captain stepped forward, his voice steady as he took over. "Ms. Margot, the events of today will be included in a formal report for review. But I hope you understand that what Mr. Cross and Mr. Tate are saying is not simply a critique of your behavior. This is a lesson, not just for you but for all of us on this team." Margot lifted her head, her eyes red but dry. She looked at Wesley, then at Julian, feeling the weight of their words settle fully into her conscience. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice small but earnest. "I allowed my misguided thoughts to lead to actions that never should have happened. I have no excuses for what I did. All I can do is promise that it will never happen again." Wesley nodded, his expression softening. "An apology doesn't change the past, but I hope it changes your future and the future of Skybridge Airlines. We cannot stand for discrimination. This must be a place where everyone is treated with respect, no matter who they are." Julian smiled faintly, his eyes conveying agreement. "A place where compassion comes first." The room fell silent after Wesley's words. Margot remained standing, her eyes slightly red but no longer filled with defiance or defensiveness. She bowed her head, took a deep breath, and summoned all the courage she could to face the consequences. "I'm sorry, Mr. Tate," Margot repeated, her voice slow but sincere. "I allowed my biases to influence my actions. I didn't realize that something as small as a glance, a word, or an attitude could make someone feel diminished." Wesley listened in silence, the sharp edge of his gaze softening. Margot continued, her tone steady despite the weight of her guilt. "I know I hurt your family. Not just you, but the values that Skybridge Airlines stands for. I don't expect that an apology can undo everything, but I will carry this lesson with me for the rest of my life." The captain stood quietly, his expression neutral but understanding. For him, it was the first time seeing Margot, a woman who prided herself on perfection, admit her faults so openly. Wesley nodded, his face thoughtful. He stepped closer, standing directly in front of Margot. "I am not a man who hasn't made mistakes," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But mistakes only matter if we learn from them. I hope you will take this opportunity to change your perspective and your actions, not just for yourself, but for the passengers you'll serve in the future." Margot lifted her gaze, meeting Wesley's eyes. "I will, sir. I promise." Julian Cross, who had been seated quietly, smiled faintly as he stood. He stepped beside Wesley, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "Wesley," Julian said, his tone gentle but authoritative, "what you did today wasn't just about justice for your family. You sent a powerful message about the values we all need to uphold." Wesley returned the smile, though he said nothing in reply. Julian turned to Margot, his voice softer now. "Margot, I believe everyone deserves a chance to make things right. Use this lesson to become better, not just as a professional, but as a person. And remember, sometimes compassion matters more than perfection." Margot nodded, her emotions a mix of heaviness and relief. Heaviness from her mistakes, but relief in knowing she had been given the chance to change. Wesley glanced at his watch before addressing the captain. "Thank you for taking the time to address this. I hope that Skybridge will continue to uphold the values it once represented. That's why I chose to acquire this airline, because I believe it can become a symbol of respect and unity." The captain nodded. "I am committed to ensuring that happens, Mr. Tate." Wesley turned back to Margot, his expression gentler now. "Good luck, Margot. I hope that the next time we fly with Skybridge, our experience will be different. And I hope you will be different too." Margot bowed her head slightly, unable to find words to respond. As Wesley and Julian exited the VIP lounge, Margot remained in place, their parting words echoing in her mind. Prejudice, whether large or small, has the power to destroy. But compassion has the power to heal it all. She took a deep breath, realizing that today was not just a lesson. It was a turning point in her life. Margot felt as though her feet were glued to the floor. When Serena entered the VIP room, Margot could barely lift her head. Serena's presence was no longer that of just a passenger Margot could brush aside. She stood there, her eyes bright but shadowed with quiet pain. Serena stopped a few steps away, keeping a deliberate distance, ensuring that every word she spoke would be heard clearly. "Ms. Margot," Serena began, her voice gentle but resolute, "I know to you we're just an ordinary family. Perhaps in your eyes, we don't look like the kind of passengers you're used to serving here. But I want you to understand one thing. To sit in those seats, we worked very hard." Margot lifted her head, meeting Serena's gaze. Her eyes carried no anger, only patience and an unwavering sense of dignity. Serena continued, her voice growing firmer with each word. "Biases like yours are nothing new to us. We've faced them in many places, in many situations. And every time, it makes us feel like we always have to prove ourselves, to prove that we belong, to prove that we deserve not just what we've earned, but the basic right to be treated as equals." Those words pierced Margot's pride like a dagger. She bit her lip, trying to hold back tears. "Do you know something, Margot?" Serena asked, her tone softening. "What you did today didn't just hurt us. It reminded us that no matter how successful we become, no matter what we achieve, the prejudice of others is something we will always have to face." Margot didn't have a chance to respond to Serena before Wesley entered the room. He walked over to his wife, resting a steady hand on her shoulder, as though to bolster her strength. His expression wasn't angry, but the unwavering resolve in his eyes and the deliberate way he moved made Margot feel as though she were being scrutinized under an unrelenting spotlight. "Ms. Margot," Wesley began, his voice calm and clear. "I heard what my wife said, and I want to emphasize that this isn't about something personal between us and you. This is about how even the smallest biases can have a profound impact on how we treat one another." Wesley took a step closer, his gaze locking on Margot without hesitation. "Your actions on that flight weren't accidental. You deliberately reassigned us to seats near the lavatories. You ignored our requests. And when you had no choice but to serve us, you did so with a cold detachment. You might think those were small details, but it's in those details that the truth is revealed. Margot opened her mouth to respond, but Wesley raised a hand to stop her. "No, Margot, let me finish," he continued, his voice growing firmer. "You didn't think we belonged in first class. Maybe you assumed we didn't have the money, the power, or perhaps we simply didn't look like the kind of people you believe deserve to be there. That's bias. And bias, no matter how small, has the power to destroy." Margot stood frozen, Wesley's words striking at the deepest corners of her shame. Wesley paused for a moment, as if to ensure his message sank in. "You know, this isn't the first time we've encountered something like this. But this time, we have the ability to change it. As the new owners of Skybridge Airlines, I will ensure that this doesn't happen again. Not to us, and not to anyone who boards a Skybridge flight." Margot couldn't bear it any longer. She lowered her head, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I'm sorry. I truly am. I didn't realize I was carrying that bias. I was wrong." Serena and Wesley stood silently, watching her. They weren't looking for tears or excuses. What they wanted was change, not just from Margot, but from everyone responsible for operating the airline. Wesley's voice was slow, deliberate, and weighted with meaning. "An apology is only the beginning, Margot. What matters is what you do next." The silence in the VIP room was so heavy that Margot could hear the thudding of her own heartbeat. Serena and Wesley had said everything that needed to be said, but the stillness that followed didn't offer her relief. It only amplified her tension. Julian Cross, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, slowly rose to his feet. He stepped forward, his small black notebook still clasped in one hand. His gaze wasn't angry, but its sharpness was enough to make Margot feel as though she were being laid bare under a merciless light. "Margot," Julian began, his voice low and steady. "I've flown with Skybridge Airlines for many years. I've always admired how this airline creates exceptional experiences for its passengers, and I've met many outstanding crew members along the way. But what I witnessed today makes me question whether those values are still being upheld." Margot lifted her head, but couldn't summon the courage to meet Julian's eyes. "Do you know what I found most troubling about today's flight?" Julian asked, his gaze locking onto Margot's with unflinching clarity. "It wasn't just the way you treated the Tate family. It was how you allowed prejudice to dictate every one of your actions, from reassigning their seats to the cold indifference with which you served them. You turned an ordinary family into the target of discrimination simply because they didn't fit the image you deemed worthy." Margot bowed her head further, unable to speak. Julian took another step closer, his voice growing firmer. "Margot, do you understand that such biases have the power to undermine everything Skybridge Airlines is trying to build? This isn't just about you and the Tates. It's a much larger issue, a question of the trust customers place in this airline." Wesley nodded in agreement, his gaze directed at Julian with quiet gratitude. Julian turned to Wesley, his tone resolute. "Mr. Tate, I believe what happened today serves as a significant lesson, not just for Margot, but for all of us. We must constantly remind ourselves that prejudice, no matter how small, can have far-reaching consequences." Wesley placed a hand on Julian's shoulder, nodding solemnly. "Thank you, Julian. Your words are absolutely right. And I hope that Skybridge Airlines will become a place where moments like today never happen again." Margot stood there, every word from Julian and Wesley ringing in her ears like a wake-up call. She lifted her head, her eyes brimming with tears, but there was no longer any avoidance in her gaze. "I am truly sorry," Margot said, her voice trembling but sincere. "I have no excuse for what I've done. I was wrong. I allowed my biases to cloud the professionalism I once prided myself on. I promise, from this moment forward, I will work not just with skill, but with compassion." Serena stepped closer, her expression softening slightly. Her voice was gentle but firm as she said, "Margot, what we need isn't just an apology. We need you to understand that every action, no matter how small, can leave a significant impact. And we need you to prove that you can change." Wesley turned to the captain, his tone serious but no longer harsh. "Thank you for handling this matter professionally. I hope Skybridge Airlines will always uphold the values we believe in. The captain nodded, his voice steady. "Mr. Tate, I assure you that what happened today will not be forgotten. We will make sure the entire team understands the lessons from this incident." As Wesley and Serena prepared to leave, Wesley turned back to Margot one last time. His voice was deliberate and meaningful as he said, "An apology is just the beginning. Your actions are what will define you. I hope that the next time we meet, you will be a different Margot, a better Margot." Margot nodded, the weight in her chest lifting slightly, though the burden of her mistakes remained. As the door to the VIP room closed, Julian gave Margot a faint smile. His voice carried a quiet encouragement as he said, "Don't let today's lesson be just a source of pain. Let it be the drive to change." Margot nodded again, her eyes reflecting newfound determination. Deep down, she knew that while today's mistakes would never be erased, she would ensure they would never be repeated. Several months after the incident in the VIP lounge in Paris, Margot had completely transformed the way she approached her work and herself. To fulfill the promise she made to Wesley Tate, she enrolled in a training program on unconscious bias. There, she learned how to identify and manage the subtle, automatic thoughts that often lead to discriminatory behavior. Margot didn't stop there. She also volunteered with a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting equity in customer service. During meetings with colleagues from around the globe, she listened to countless stories of injustice that people had endured. These stories not only deepened her understanding, but also ignited in her a desire to right her own wrongs. On a crisp autumn morning, Margot sat at the small desk in her apartment. Before her lay a blank sheet of paper, and in her slightly trembling hand was a pen. Slowly, deliberately, she began to write a letter filled with heartfelt sincerity to the Tate family. "Dear Mr. Wesley and Mrs. Serena Tate, I am writing this letter to express my deepest gratitude for the lesson you taught me. That experience not only made me aware of my mistakes, but also changed me forever. I have since attended a course on unconscious bias and spent time volunteering to better understand the impact that prejudice can have. I am committed to ensuring that my actions will never again cause harm to others. Once again, I am profoundly sorry for what happened, and I hope that on a future flight, I can show you a different Margot, a better Margot." She signed the letter, folded it carefully, and slipped it into a sealed envelope. As Margot placed the envelope on her desk, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. While the past couldn't be rewritten, she knew she had begun a journey to make amends, and to ensure that her actions would align with the values she now understood so deeply. On a late December day, Margot was invited to speak at a seminar on equitable customer service. The hall was packed, with the front rows filled by managers, flight attendants, and service professionals from various airlines. Margot stepped onto the stage, holding a microphone. There was a trace of nervousness in her movements, but her eyes shone with determination. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began. "My name is Margot Evans, and I've worked in the aviation industry for over 15 years. I used to believe I understood what professionalism meant, that as long as I followed the rules and delivered service by the book, I was a good flight attendant." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "But in one flight, I realized how wrong I was. I let my biases dictate how I treated a family. And in doing so, I didn't just hurt them. I betrayed the very values this job is supposed to represent." Margot recounted the story of the fateful flight, the Tate family, and the lessons she learned from that experience. Her voice grew heavier with emotion as she said, "We must see every individual with fairness and respect, not through the lens of our prejudices. It's not just the right thing to do. It's our duty as service professionals." She lifted her head, her eyes brimming with conviction. "I'm not standing here to hide my mistakes. I'm standing here to say that no one is perfect, but we can be better if we face our flaws, own them, and commit to change." In the front row, Julian Cross sat quietly, his gaze following every word Margot spoke. When she concluded her speech, he smiled faintly and gave a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. Julian had witnessed Margot's fall from grace, but now he also bore witness to her remarkable rise from the very place where she had stumbled. Deep down, He felt reassured that Skybridge Airlines, under Wesley Tate's leadership, would continue to stand not only as a symbol of luxury, but also as a beacon of fairness and compassion. Outside the hall, Margot stepped off the stage, feeling lighter than she had in years. She passed by a framed photograph hanging on the wall, a picture of Skybridge Airlines' Boeing 777 soaring against a backdrop of endless blue sky. Margot stopped and gazed at the image for a long moment. A gentle smile graced her lips as she thought to herself, "No one is perfect, but I will never stop striving to be better each day." The golden glow of the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the path Margot was now walking. A path built on commitment, humility, and an earnest desire to become a better person. No one is perfect, but we can be better by facing our mistakes and committing to change. Respecting others is not a privilege. It is a responsibility. Margot's story reminds us that even the smallest biases can cause deep harm and erode the core values of fairness. In today's increasingly diverse world, treating others with fairness and respect is not just a moral imperative, but a key to building meaningful and lasting relationships. To combat prejudice, we must listen, empathize, and resist the urge to judge hastily. Respect is not optional. It is our duty to foster a more compassionate and united community. If you like this story, leave a 1 in the comments and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more surprising and inspiring stories. We can't wait to hear from you.